One of the recurring themes on this channel is that if you want to understand the present, you have to understand the past. And today we're going to talk about a constitutional problem that's nearly 700 years old. Now, the names have changed, the politics have changed, and the labels have changed, but the underlying abuse remains exactly the same. Hi, I'm Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. In 16th century England, kings called their enemies traitors. In 21st century America, politicians increasingly call their enemies terrorists. And while those words are different, the danger is remarkably similar. Today, I want to talk about President Trump's NSPD 7 directive and the efforts to label Antifa a terrorist organization. Not because I support Antifa, although I do, and not because I oppose Antifa, because I don't, but because this controversy raises a much bigger question. What happens when governments start stretching politically charged legal labels beyond their ordinary meaning? And again, to understand this problem, you need to go back nearly 700 years to 1352. Now, in that year, England enacted what became known as the Statute of Treason. Now, that law was actually a reform. Kings had been accusing people of treason whenever it suited them politically. So Parliament attempted to establish clearer rules. Treason would be limited to specific acts, such as plotting the king's death, levying war against the crown, or aiding the king's enemies. The principle was relatively straightforward. Treason should mean something precise. In fact, that is a principle that still exists in Anglo-American law. A law cannot be enforced if it is void for vagueness. The definitions must be specific to put people on notice. Now, in this instance, the word treason should describe very specific conduct, not opinions. Treason, as a cause of action, should punish actual threats to the state, not political disagreements. But, as is frequently the case throughout history, that principle did not survive contact with power. Over the following centuries, English monarchs repeatedly stretched the definition of treason whenever it became politically convenient. The most notorious example was King Henry VIII. Henry VIII did not merely punish armed rebellion using treason. He transformed treason as a crime into a weapon against political dissent. Questioning his authority over the Church of England could be treason. Refusing to endorse his preferred succession plan could be treason. Expressing the wrong opinion about royal policy could become treason. There were a few pretty famous examples of this, including at least two of his wives. But arguably the most famous victim was Sir Thomas More. Thomas More did not lead an army against England. Far from it. He had actually been an advisor to the king. He did not attempt to overthrow the government. He did not conspire with a foreign power. His only offense was refusing to publicly endorse King Henry VIII's religious and political agenda. In the case of Sir Thomas More, Henry VIII had effectively transformed disagreement into disloyalty. King Henry VIII twisted and expanded the definition of treason in order to get revenge against Sir Thomas More. And Sir Thomas More, pretty famously, lost his head. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear about something. Treason as a crime is real. The framers of our own Constitution were not saying that treason didn't exist. In fact, they specifically mentioned treason in the Constitution. They understood perfectly well that some people genuinely do wage war against their own country, aid foreign enemies, or attempt to overthrow constitutional governments by force. That is why the U.S. Constitution defines treason and provides for its punishment. Now, likewise, terrorism is real, but terrorism is not a slogan. It is not merely a political label. It refers to the use or threat of violence for political purposes. Violence is the sine qua non of terrorism. Terrorism is a genuine crime that causes genuine harm, and governments have both a duty and an authority to protect the public from it. The problem is not that these concepts like treason and terrorism exist as crimes, as causes of action under the law. The problem is not that governments prosecute genuine traitors or genuine terrorists. The problem is when governments begin stretching these concepts beyond their objectively reasonable meanings for nefarious purposes. The danger begins when officials stop using these words to describe objectively reasonable and objectively definable crimes and start using them to describe people that they don't like. That's exactly what happened under King Henry VIII. The Crown did not abolish treason, the Crown expanded it. It gradually transformed a crime directed at genuine threats to the state into a weapon that could be used against dissent, disagreement, and nonconformity. And unfortunately, that's what we're starting to see from the Trump administration as well. Authoritarian governments rarely eliminate laws. More often than not, they expand them and redefine them. They take a legitimate legal concept and stretch it until it reaches people who are never supposed to fall within its scope. The issue is not the existence of the laws, The issue is the manipulation of the law. That is the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook. King Henry VIII's famous abuses were not ancient history to the founding generation. When Americans think about King Henry VIII, we tend to think of a distant historical figure. The framers did not. The abuses of the House of Tudor were part of the shared constitutional memory of the entire English-speaking world, including the North American colonies. The founders studied Tudor history. They discussed Tudor history. They understood exactly how governments tend to use vague political crimes to suppress dissent. In fact, the Federalist Papers specifically discussed the dangers associated with politically motivated prosecutions and praised the Constitution's narrow definition of treason. And yes, since the founding of the American Republic, treason has been well defined. Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution provides that treason consists only of levying war against the United States or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. That's it. Nothing else fits within the definition. Certainly not criticizing the government, certainly not opposing the president, certainly not participating in unpopular political movements, and not expressing radical ideas. The framers did not trust future governments with the power to redefine political opposition as a crime against the state. They were specifically trying to prevent the sort of abuses that had occurred under English monarchs like King Henry VIII. And today, no American president can realistically define treason to encompass their political opponents. The Constitution was built to prevent that. But the temptations have never disappeared, and the Trump administration has willfully given in to those temptations. They're simply using a different word. In the 21st century, the politically useful label is often not traitor, but terrorist. The dangers that the framers identified remain exactly the same. The danger is not the existence of terrorism. The danger is the temptation to redefine terrorism the same way that English kings redefined treason. If your opponents are merely wrong, you have to persuade people. If your opponents are criminals, you have to prove your case in court. But if your opponents are terrorists, you can justify extraordinary measures. You can expand surveillance. You can claim emergency powers. You can restrict civil liberties. You can bypass ordinary political debate. That is why governments are always tempted to broaden the label. And that brings us back to NSPD 7 and its attempts to target Antifa as a terrorist group. Now, what exactly is Antifa? The answer is that Antifa is not an organization at all. It's an ideology, at best. The word itself is simply shorthand for anti-fascist. More broadly, it describes opposition to authoritarianism. Now, you may agree with that ideology. You may disagree with that ideology. You may think some people who identify with it are admirable. You may think some people who identify with it are fools. But that's not the point. The point is that ideologies are not criminal actors. Ideas do not commit crimes. People commit crimes. And occasionally, organizations, as collectives of people, commit crimes. And the government has both the authority and the responsibility to investigate, arrest, prosecute, and imprison people and organizations who use violence to advance political objectives. If someone commits assault, prosecute the assault. If someone commits arson, prosecute the arson. If someone commits murder, prosecute the murder. If an actual organization uses violence to achieve a political objective, investigate and prosecute the organization. But that is a fundamentally different concept from targeting an ideology. The government is not allowed to criminalize ideas simply because it finds those ideas threatening, offensive, or politically inconvenient. And that's why the logic behind targeting Antifa as a terrorist organization ultimately collapses. Because as a threshold matter, Antifa is not an organization. It's simply an idea. And again, ideas cannot commit terrorism. Only people can. NSPD 7 and Donald Trump's counterterrorism policy under Sebastian Gorka begins to resemble the very abuse that concerned the framers. Instead of identifying specific unlawful conduct perpetrated by specific people and organizations, the government begins by identifying an ideology and then works backwards in search of a legal justification. That's not how that's supposed to work. In a constitutional republic, in a nation founded on the rule of law, conduct determines criminal liability. Ideology does not. Donald Trump's counterterrorism policy is one of the dumbest tautologies in the history of counterterrorism. Because by targeting Antifa as an ideology, by targeting the mere idea that governments shouldn't be authoritarian, and then using authoritarian tactics to overcome that ideology, the Trump administration's argument has effectively become, we must expand government power in order to suppress people who oppose the expansion of government power. Boiled down to its essence, Donald Trump's counterterrorism policy effectively becomes, we have to expand government power in order to suppress people who oppose the expansion of government power. Or, to put it another way, we must use authoritarian methods to protect society from anti-authoritarian ideals. Donald Trump's policies embodied in NSPD 7 are precisely the kinds of policies that the Constitution was designed to prevent. The lesson of King Henry VIII is not that governments invent crimes. The lesson is that governments expand their definitions to encompass their political enemies. And that is exactly what Donald Trump is doing here. The framers knew that liberty survives only when legal definitions remain narrow, objective, and tied to observable conduct rather than beliefs. And the lesson of NSPD 7 is that the temptation to redefine political opposition as a threat to the state never disappeared. It merely found a new vocabulary. The names have changed, the politics have changed, the labels have changed, but the underlying abuse of authority remains exactly the same.